Hello everyone, this is Miss Q. Today we will be reading chapter 15, Boom or Bust. Boom and bust. For most Americans and Minnesotans, life changed dramatically from the 1920s to the 1930s. The stories of a young jazz musician and a farm family illustrate the contrast between the jazz age 20s and the Great Depression of the 30s. Learn too about lifestyle changes for women, what happened when the money stopped flowing, and the government's response to economic crisis. Some of the key terms you are going to be looking at are stock. What is stock? Okay, the stock market, the Great Depression. Think about, as we read, what is that? Prohibition, foreclosure, welfare, and the New Deal. Things you will be looking for, the questions that you should be asking. What was the Great Depression? Name some ways the Great Depression impacted Minnesotans. What was the jazz age? How did lifestyles change for women during the 1920s and 30s? So think about those things. What was a woman's lifestyle like in the 1920s? Then how was that different than what her lifestyle would have been like in the 1930s? What problems did farmers face during this time period? And what did private organizations and the government do to relieve the problems of the Great Depression? Look for those things as we read. A Minnesotan named Wilbur Fosse had always admired the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. For years, he had dreamed of building an office tower modeled after the famous landmark. All he needed was a few $1 million. Where was he going to find that kind of money? In 1916, Fosse borrowed $6,000 and started buying up small companies that sold gas, electricity, and water. He combined these into a large company and then sold stock. Stock is a share of ownership in a company that can be bought and sold. So he sold this stock. The shares of stock were bought and sold on the stock market, which is a place where stocks are bought and sold. Investors liked Fosse's ideas. They bought stocks, putting millions of dollars in his company. By 1927, Fosse had built a fortune of about $22 million. More than enough money to build that skyscraper he had been dreaming about. He decided to construct his office building in downtown Minneapolis. The people of Minneapolis watched with wonder as Fosse's tower rose higher and higher above the city skyline. The magnificent structure was 32 stories high, making it the tallest building west of the Mississippi. Because it seemed to prove that anything was possible, it symbolized people's hopes. So Wilbur Fosse's skyscraper towered above the Minneapolis skyline when it was built in 1929. Because he idolized George Washington, Fosse modeled his building after the shape of the Washington Monument in the nation's capital city. So that is what Fosse's building looked like in 1929. The future. In August 1929, Fosse held a 3-day celebration to mark the completion of the Fosse Tower. It was, as they say, on top of the world. Unfortunately, Fosse did not stay there for long. 2 months later, on October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashed. Fosse's fortune, which was based on the value of his company's stock, disappeared. The money he had received from investors had already been spent on his company. By November, he was broke. So were many of the people who had invested in his company. The stock market crash of 1929 was a turning point from boom to bust in the history of the United States and Minnesota. Before the crash, the economy was booming. Many city dwellers believed that life was good and would only get better. Even farmers who struggled during the 1920s had hoped that better times were ahead. After the crash, everything was different. This bust started an economic crisis that we now call the Great Depression. It swept across the nation and touched lives throughout Minnesota, from cities to small towns to farms. The crash and the Great Depression. Some Americans in the late 1920s saw the stock market as a way to get rich quickly. They could hardly be blamed for thinking that way. Investors bought shares in a business at a low price, and in a short time they were worth a lot more. Stock prices were doubling and tripling. The investors could then turn around and sell those same stocks and make a large profit. More and more investors scrambled to buy shares in all sorts of companies without considering the risks. Many people spent all their savings on stocks. Others borrowed money to join the action. All that buying and selling of stocks ended with the crash. When people talk about the crash of 1929, they are referring to this sudden fall of stock prices and a panic that fed that collapse. All of a sudden, investors were scrambling to sell their stocks. Before long, they lost all their value, but investors couldn't sell if no one wanted to buy. With no buyers, the value of the stocks sank lower and lower. The crash brought on a nationwide economic crisis that we now call the Great Depression. The year before the crash, a slight economic downturn had caused many businesses to lay off workers and cancel orders for new equipment. Without the crash, the downturn probably would have corrected itself. The crash caused people to panic as more people lost their jobs and were unable to purchase goods. More businesses went bankrupt and had to close. That caused even more people to lose their jobs. Worried Americans began holding on to their money instead of spending it. The economy kept getting worse. The Great Depression lasted for more than a decade, and it touched all Americans, rich, poor, and in between. Okay, so this shows us what happens when money stops flowing. Take a look at the circular flow model. You've seen this previous chapter. Previous chapters showed how money and resources move within an economy. This time, we'll use the model to help us understand what happens when money doesn't move within an economy. All parts of a circular flow model are connected. When the flow of one part gets interrupted, the other parts suffer too. Look at the top half of the model. It shows that households work for Minnesota industries, and those industries pay wages to households. During the Great Depression, industries laid off employees. When that happened, both arrows slowed down and sometimes stopped flowing altogether. Some households no longer worked for Minnesota Industries, and some Minnesota Industries no longer paid households. As soon as the top arrows stopped flowing, they affected the bottom arrows. When households no longer had money to pay for goods and services, industries lost income. As a result, industries were no longer able to produce as many goods and services to sell. You may be familiar with the words recession and depression. Some economists think of an economic recession as a time when the circular flow slows down, and a depression as a time when the flow between arrows is seriously interrupted. Have you heard people in the news talking about either a recession or a depression? What did they say? So, let's look at this flow chart. We have factories that are paying wages to households. So the households get their money, and then they go and they buy stuff from the factories, and the factories make money off of those households. But when that flow stops, then again, it starts affecting the goods and services, what people can eat, what they can buy as a whole gets interrupted as well. And their workforce stops. So that's kind of what happened is in that time period, because the households weren't getting paid, families weren't getting paid, they had no money to go purchase goods and services. And because they had no money to purchase goods and services, they tried to live without it. And these factories were no longer making money, so that circular flow just stopped. Okay, so before the crash, the Jazz Age, Carl Warmington was 10 years old and living in Minneapolis when he first heard the new music that everyone seemed to be listening to. After World War I, this uniquely American music was fast, happy, and fun. It came out of African American neighborhoods in New Orleans, Louisiana, and St. Louis, Missouri, and spread across the nation over the radio and on phonographs. People called the music jazz, and they referred to the 1920s as the Jazz Age. As Warmington grew older, he spent hours and hours playing jazz records on his family's phonograph. Warmington wasn't satisfied just listening to jazz. He wanted to play jazz. He started taking trumpet lessons. Soon he was playing in amateur bands around the Twin Cities. In 1923, at the age of 15, Warmington joined a 10-piece youth orchestra that performed in theaters all over Minnesota. A few years later, he picked up the trombone. By the time he was attending the University of Minnesota, Warmington was earning good money as a trombonist in several dance bands. So Carl Warmington played in the jazz band at a Breezy Point Lodge in the summers of 1929 and 1930. He is third from the front in this photograph. So right about there. Dancers gathered in 1925 at a Minneapolis dance hall to learn the latest jazz moves. Women were called flappers, and they cut their hair short and wore clothes like these. So there's a picture of the dancers. Here we go. As he toured the theaters, resorts, and roadhouses of Minnesota, Warmington soaked up the giddy excitement of the Jazzy Age. The country was at peace. Investors were getting rich in the stock market. Warmington noticed that attitudes were changing in the new era of jazz. Lifestyle changes during the Jazz Age. One place jazz was played was in illegal bars called speakeasies. The bars were illegal because of prohibition. This period was the result of a constitutional amendment that prohibited or banned making and selling alcohol. In speakeasies, however, people drank and danced. Liquor was supplied in the speakeasies by bootleggers, people who made and sold illegal or bootleg alcohol. New intimate dancing styles such as the bunny hug were introduced. Warmington later recalled speakeasies and bootleggers became popular and parties stimulated by illegal liquor took on more gaiety. Jazz music fit nicely into the new mood. Women contributed to the new mood too. Some of the changes for women during this time were obvious to Warmington. Many women were cutting their long hair short and wearing new clothing styles. Shorter dresses and loose waistlines replaced floor-length skirts and dresses that were tight around the waist. So, in the early 1900s, some young women played on basketball teams. In 1922, this 1922 photo shows a team from Wells Memorial Settlement House. Basketball team from that era. Okay, so lifestyle changes not related to appearance were even more important. More women than ever before were attending college, taking office, clerical jobs, driving automobiles, and voting in elections, all roles previously reserved for men. A strong sense of independence characterized women of the Jazz Age. In the summer of 1929, Carl Warmington played with a dance orchestra at the Breezy Point Lodge on Big Pelican Lake, not far from the town of Pequot Lakes. The lodge was a speakeasy that served illegal liquor and had an illegal gambling casino. Breezy Point was a popular destination among gangsters and Hollywood movie stars. Guests arrived in fancy cars and wore fancy clothes. Warmington did not make much money at the lodge, but he enjoyed hanging out with people who seemed to have more money than they could spend. The summer went quickly. In August, Warmington returned to the Twin Cities to continue college. 2 months later, the stock market crashed. Warmington, like many Minnesotans, did not worry very much at first about the effects of the crash. During the months that followed, he finished his college education and made plans for the coming summer. President Herbert Hoover gave me encouragement when he said that business was sound and the economy would improve. He recalled, so I signed on for another season at Breezy Point Lodge. The summer of 1930 was Carl Wilmington's last carefree summer. For a very long time, like many Minnesotans, he was about to discover that the exciting days of the Jazz Age were over. So, one of the most famous musicians of the Jazz Age was Duke Ellington. He was a composer, band leader, and a piano player. Though he wasn't from Minnesota, he influenced jazz musicians everywhere. Prohibition. In 1919, the U.S. Constitution was amended to ban the sale of liquor. This ban was called Prohibition, and it went into effect in 1920. The law that officially made liquor sales illegal was called the Volstead Act. It was named after Andrew Volstead, a Minnesota congressman who led the committee that wrote the law. Prohibition supporters, such as members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, believed it would reduce drunkenness. They hoped prohibition would make the nation a better and safer place. It did not. If anything, prohibition made drinking alcohol more fashionable. Illegal saloons called speakeasies opened up in nearly every city. Gangsters moved in to control the supply of bootleg or illegal liquor. Minnesota was a perfect location for bootleggers. They smuggled or snuck liquor into Minnesota from Canada and sent it by train to St. Paul. Police raids, like the one pictured here, did little to control illegal liquor. Profits from the illegal activity turned several small-time bootleggers in St. Paul, Minnesota, into powerful criminal bosses. They bribed city officials and police officers to protect their illegal bootleg business. Well-known gangsters like George Machine Gun Kelly, Barnes, and John Dillinger hid out in St. Paul because they knew they would be safe. Gangster Alvin Creepy Karpis put it this way: of all the Midwest cities, the one that I know best was St. Paul, and it was a crook's haven. Every criminal of any importance in the 1930s made his home at one time or another in St. Paul. If you were looking for a guy you hadn't seen for a few months, you usually thought of two places, prison or St. Paul. If he wasn't locked up or in one, he was probably hanging out in the other. By the 1930s, most Americans believed that prohibition was a mistake. Drinking was still common, and crime had increased because of illegal liquor sales. In 1933, the nation changed the Constitution again, this time to get rid of prohibition. The bootleggers were out of business. St. Paul's gangster era soon came to an end. Before the crash, the farm crisis. So, in the 1920s had been good years for many city dwellers, but they were hard years for the people of Minnesota small towns and farms. Rural Minnesota's problems had started shortly after World War I ended. During the war, the government had encouraged farmers to produce more food to keep American and British soldiers and civilians from going hungry. After the war, farmers continued to produce more even though the demand for their goods increased. As a result, prices for farm products dropped dramatically. By 1922, farmers earned less than half the income they had received 3 years earlier for their wheat and corn. The prices they got for their pigs and beef cows were not much better. Farmers who owed money on their farms found it increasingly difficult to repay their debts. More and more of them went bankrupt or broke. The people of Otter Tail County were among thousands of Minnesotans who felt the sting of the 1920s farm crisis. Otter Tail County's economy depended heavily on the farm's meat processing plants and businesses that served farmers' needs. When farmers could no longer afford to buy what they'd bought previously, local businesses began to fail. Rural people in many jobs went further and further into debt as a result of the poor farm economy. In one way, Otter Tail County was better off than most rural areas in the state. Many farmers in Otter Tail County found a new agricultural product that allowed them to adapt to the hard times. After years of farming nothing but wheat, their soil had become less productive. Some farmers turned from growing wheat to milking cows. By the late 1920s, Otter Tail County was one of the state's top producers of dairy products such as milk and cheese. Prices for dairy products in the 1920s did not drop as much as those for wheat, corn, pigs, and beef cows. Many Otter Tail County farmers did not suffer as much as other farmers in the state. So this is a picture of Conrad and Elizabeth Toso. They posed with their 9 children and Elizabeth's mother around 1936. One family in Otter Tail County feels the sting. Conrad and Elizabeth Toso were among the many Otter Tail County farmers who made the switch to dairy farming. They lived with their 9 children in Maplewood, a heavily wooded township that was difficult to farm. Their farm was small, 40 acres. They could manage up to 10 milk cows. The Toso's small dairy operation did not produce much income, but it was enough to help the family get by. Like many Otter Tail County farmers, the Tosos largely fed themselves. They kept hogs and chickens and had a vegetable garden. We never went hungry, Conrad recalled, but the table was always clean. The children ate what was on the table. The Tosos and most other Otter Tail County farmers managed to hold on to their farms through the tough years of the 1920s. Then the stock market crashed. A major economic depression set in. Hard times on Minnesota farms were far from over. After the crash, the job crisis. Back in the city, Carl Wilmington got a rude surprise. It was the fall of 1930, a year after the crash. He had just finished his summer orchestra gig at the Breezy Point Lodge and was looking for a new job, but he could not find one. Not in Minneapolis, not anywhere. The economic crisis triggered by the stock market crash, the Great Depression, was spreading quickly through Minnesota and the rest of the nation. By the fall of 1930, private organizations such as the Salvation Army were struggling to provide welfare to a growing population of people without jobs and homes. Wilmington thought his college degree would help him find a job. Even in tough times, he was wrong. I looked in vain for any kind of full-time position, he recalled. I watched the want ads and filled out employment applications without a call back. Even though he had no job, Wilmington still felt luckier than many people since he had a place to live with his parents. Welfare, aid in the form of money of necessities for people experiencing financial hardships. And foreclosure, that was another one you were supposed to look for, is a legal process in which the money lender, such as a bank, takes over ownership of a property because the borrower fails to make payments for the property to the lender. One day in December of 1930, he visited a friend's father. The man worked for a private organization that gave vouchers or tickets for meals and lodging to homeless men in Minneapolis. Years later, he described his impressions of what was called the soup line, where people could turn in a voucher to get a hot meal. What a dark and dreary sight. It had begun to snow, and the wind was howling down this deserted lane. Stretched along the side of an empty building was a long line of shivering men, many with only light jackets. The line reached down the alley to a fire escape that crawled up the side of this dark warehouse to the second floor. The only action from this long queue of men was from their stomping feet in the snow. Few jobs, many people. Among the men and women who struggled were those who had worked farms, mined the Iron Range, logged forests, labored in factories, or worked in offices. Now some who had built up Minnesota's industries were jobless and waiting in line for a chance to eat a hot meal and sleep in a warm bed. Skilled workers fared better than unskilled ones, but people in every industry were hit hard. Frequently, African Americans and American Indians were the first to be laid off and the last to be hired. During these tough economic times, nearly half the African Americans in Minnesota in 1920 had been born in the South. Many had come north to escape desegregation and seek new opportunities. Although most found the situation in Minnesota an improvement, few were treated as equals by European Americans. For American Indians in Minnesota, the majority of whom lived on reservations, the Great Depression was a continuation of the hard times they had experienced for decades. During this time, men were generally considered the main breadwinners of economic providers for families. Women, who made up just over 20% of the American workforce in 1930, often lost their jobs in favor of keeping men employed. Most women were married, and most of their husbands were still employed, but their wages had been cut dramatically. Others had husbands who had lost their jobs altogether, just as men did. Women struggled to provide for themselves and their families during the economic crisis. A few years into the crisis, the wife of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt wrote a book titled "It's Up to the Women." In it, Eleanor Roosevelt offered these words of praise and encouragement to women. The needs of life must be met, and it is woman's courage and determination which time and again have pulled us through worse crises than the present one. And there is a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt. The First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt visited Minnesota several times during the 1930s. This photo shows her arriving by plane. And if you look closely, this shows a picture of men who are looking for work and can't find anything. So they are lying on the grass. The Gateway District in Minneapolis became a gathering place for homeless and jobless people during the Great Depression. There's a picture of that. Okay, a job for Carl Warmington. In early 1931, Carl Warmington finally landed an office job with the city of Minneapolis. Before long, he was transferred to the city's Department of Public Relief the agency that helped people who needed housing, food, counseling, health care, and clothing. By this time, about 35,000 people in the workforce of 22,000 and 212,000, 1 in 6 had lost their jobs in Minneapolis. Over the next few years, Warmington and his fellow relief workers tried hard to make life better for the thousands of Minneapolis residents who needed help. Still, there was only so much Warmington's office could do. The Great Depression was a national or federal crisis, not a city crisis. City funds were limited. Warmington recalled, "It was not until federal funds were made available that improved care for homeless people was possible." A new president is elected. In 1932, the American people elected a new president with a new vision. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had won by promising a New Deal for the American people. His first challenge was to fight panic among Americans and restore their confidence in the country's economic system. Within his first 100 days in office, the federal government passed 15 bills to deal with the crisis. The executive and legislative branches of the government worked together to make this happen. President Roosevelt proposed each bill, Congress passed it, and then the president signed it into law. To gain public support, the president took his ideas and his programs straight to the American people. He started a series of radio broadcasts called Fireside Chats. Many Americans approved of Roosevelt's plans, which were called the New Deal. Those who did felt hope for the future now that the government was trying to relieve their misery. So, during the 1930s, many Americans listened to Fireside Chats that the President Roosevelt broadcast over the radio, and this is a picture of a lady listening to her radio in the 1930s. After the crash, the New Deal. The New Deal sounded like a good news to rural people, such as the Tosos of Ottawa County. By 1932, the Great Depression had driven prices for farm products lower than they had ever seen during the dark days of the 1920s. It looked like the state's farm economy was on the verge of collapse. Families throughout rural Minnesota were frightened. They hoped help would come soon. In 1933, a new federal agency called the Agricultural Adjustment Administration started a program to raise prices for farm goods. This would provide relief for farmers. President Roosevelt went on the radio to explain how the AAA would work. Many farmers, including Conrad and Elizabeth Toso, were skeptical at first. "He promised us that he was going to give everybody work," Conrad recalled, "and of course that puzzled us. We wondered how he could do that." The Tosos' questions were answered the following year when drought struck a large part of Minnesota, including Ottawa County. Fields dried up from lack of rain. Farmers could not find enough feed to keep their dairy cows alive. Conrad Toso, for example, resorted to feeding his cows Russian thistle, a plant that was hard for the animals to digest. Then the federal government stepped in. The AAA offered to buy any cattle that the farmers in Ottawa County could not afford to keep. The Tosos sold 6 of their 10 cows for $20 apiece. The money they received from the New Deal program helped them get through the summer. More help on the way. In 1936, drought struck again, and another federal agency came to the rescue, the Works Progress Administration provided money to put people to work. It paid for public projects such as repairing schools, improving roads, and building new ball fields in Ottawa County. Drought-stricken farmers worked on WPA road projects and received livestock feed and crop seeds as payment. It was hard work, hacking through brush to clear the way for new roads, but Conrad Toso was happy to do it. There were no jobs to get whatsoever, he recalled. It was the only thing you could do. Of all the New Deal agencies, none was as popular in rural Minnesota as the Rural Electrification Administration, or the REA. In the 1930s, most Minnesotan farms had no electricity. The REA set out to change that. It encouraged farmers to join together to form cooperatives, associations that would help them set up electricity. Then the REA funneled money to these organized groups. This money was used to provide low-cost loans to farmers who wanted to bring electricity to their farms. The cooperatives bought electricity from existing power plants and then built power lines to carry that electricity to the farms. By 1939, about 800 farmers in Ottawa County were enjoying the benefits of the REA, but Conrad and Elizabeth Toso were not among them. "We didn't have the cash to do it," recalled Conrad. "I wanted it in the worst way." Rural electrification went slowly. Most Minnesota farms did not get electricity for another 10 or 15 years. Still, without the REA, getting electricity would have taken much longer. So here's the farmers in western Minnesota. They faced severe droughts in the 1930s. In the summer of 1936, the farmer's soil was dry enough to shift through his fingers. Throughout the United States, the REA work crews strung electrical wires across the rural areas. The crew worked in northern Minnesota in the 1930s. The New Deal pumped more than $1 billion into Minnesota between 1933 and 1939. It put people to work, gave people hope, and propped up the economy. It also convinced many Minnesotans that government could and should play an active role in people's lives. Yet even with all these benefits, the New Deal did not end the Great Depression. Farm prices remained low and millions of people were still out of work. It would take another world war to shake the United States and Minnesota out of their long economic nightmare. The end. Okay, there's still more that you could potentially read, but that is where I am going to stop. Good job, and goodbye.